Good evening. I'm Larry Antonatos, a Vice President of the Society for Contemporary Art. I'm standing in tonight for President Patty Sternberg, who is unable to be here. I'm pleased to welcome you to the SCA's final public program of the 2023 season, an artist talk with Jacqueline Humphries, generously sponsored by Dirk, Denison, and David Salkin. Before our programming chair, Jessica Diamond, introduces tonight's guest of honor, I would like to share our upcoming members' events with you. The SCA is looking forward to this year's annual meeting and acquisition vote on Wednesday, May 31, which will take place at the museum in Griffin Court. Members will view the artworks considered for acquisition, hear presentations on the art and artists from curators in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, and select an artwork to enter the museum's permanent collection. Members will also vote on the board slate for 2023-24. The annual meeting is always a highlight of the season for our members, and we hope to see you there. And if you have not joined our membership yet, this is a great time of the year to do so. On the morning of Monday, June 5, SCA members will enjoy a private tour of Salvador Dali, The Image Disappears, with curator Caitlin Haskell, before the museum opens to the public for the day. It will be a wonderful opportunity to gain additional insights into a critical period of Dali's career and his invention of his own brand of surrealism. Be sure to sign up soon, as capacity will be limited. On Saturday, June 17, SCA members will enjoy a tour of select galleries in Westtown. We will hear from the gallerists about their current shows and end with a reception at Marianne Ibrahim's beautiful outdoor patio. Next season's public programming and members' events will first be announced at the annual meeting on May 31st, and shortly thereafter on the SCA's website, scaic.org. If you are interested in becoming involved with the Society for Contemporary Art and attending these upcoming member events, I encourage you to become a member of the SCA via our website. All are welcome, and we have a limited number of reduced cost friend, artist, and junior memberships available by application on our website. We hope you will consider joining the SCA. The SCA continuously seeks new supporters, and we encourage you to contact the office if you are interested in sponsoring a program or event as an individual or a corporate partner this upcoming season. And now I'd like to invite SCA Programming Chair Jessica Diamond to introduce tonight's special guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you to everyone in our audience for being here this evening. Tonight, we are very honored to welcome New York-based artist Jacqueline Humphries to the Art Institute of Chicago. By the mid-1980s, painting had been declared dead several times over, but for Humphries, the medium became a rogue practice. However risky, painting has remained her foundation. She is an artist who has insisted on testing the limits of what abstraction can mean in the 21st century. Throughout her career, Humphries has adapted to and subverted painting's formal, discursive conditions, often with reference to both art history and cutting-edge technological formats. Humphries' work was included in the 59th Venice Biennale, The Milk of Dreams, in 2022, and was the subject of a major survey at the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus in 2021. Other institutional solo exhibitions include Dia Art Foundation, the Dan Flavin Art Institute, Bridgehampton, New York, 2019, Carnegie Museum of Art, Pittsburgh, 2015, and Contemporary Art Center, New Orleans, 2015. Her work is also a part of the permanent collection here at the Art Institute of Chicago. And now please join me in warmly welcoming Jacqueline Humphries.
Hello. Thank you, Jessica and Larry, for that introduction. And I'd also like to thank you, Jessica, for inviting me here today. It's very nice to be here, and thank you all for coming. And I'd also like to thank James Rondeau, Director of the Art Institute, and Ann Goldstein, unfortunately, who can't be here. She has COVID, and also Robin Farrell and Giampaolo Bianconi, Associate Curators at the Art Institute. And I'd like also to introduce you to my colleague and collaborator, Felix Bernstein, who's sitting in the second row. And Felix and I work very closely together on this talk. We've also worked on other projects, and we're working on some kind of book project together. You know, I always wanted to rewrite Alberti's treatise on painting for abstraction, so we're kind of, which is impossible, right? But we're kind of working our way sideways towards that goal. So I'll be showing a lot of early work, actually, for those who don't know it, and kind of discussing the entire arc of my career, and kind of mixing up with things that are more recent. And because I'm not a natural speaker, I'm going to read a lot. But also, I want to explain that we have the big projector, but we had some technical issues with the projector, so we put this monitor here just to give you a better idea of the kind of color, because some of the colors in the painting are very crucial to how I'm talking about the work. So, okay, so I'll just begin. When I started painting in the 80s, there was a lot of talk about the death of painting. It was considered passé, apolitical, incapable of representing the concerns of contemporary life. One of the ways I grappled with this was by thematizing death in the work itself. Since painting has long been threatened with death, first by photography, then by critical theory, now by AI and social media, I've continued to kill and revive painting in my work. I call some of my most recent paintings horror paintings, treating the canvas as a kind of body that has been pierced, slashed, and violated so that it oozes out blood and slime in the excessive and melodramatic spirit of schlock horror. But I also toy with the death of painting by testing the presumed differences between vital, expressive, painterly gestures and deadly, rote, mechanical marks. This shows the palette of blood splatters I've been working with to make the stencils for my latest paintings. Some taken from forensic crime websites, and some from studio pours that we just make samples of poured paint and make stencils off them, resize them and everything. Blurring the difference between real and fake pours and splatters has been an interest of mine since I started painting, as I've struggled against the cliches of abstract expressionism, which depict painting as the spontaneous overflow of kinetic gestures. I've tried to recast and remold the vocabulary of painting so that it is not condemned to a binary choice between nostalgic, expressive vitality and death by mechanical reproduction. This is the first group of paintings I made in 1985 while I was a fellow in the Whitney ISP program, which was highly suspicious of painting then. I called them disappearing paintings, and they actually have disappeared, which is why you're looking at Polaroids. They are monochromatic panels that go from dark to light and large to small, and maybe reference the shrinking feeling I had as a painter in that environment. It set up some of the ways of working which I continue to use: painting in series, playing with the gaps and relationships between panels, testing the inner and outer boundaries of painting. You can also maybe see from the striated lines that the paintings were not made with a brush, but that I used a taping knife to apply paint. Not long before I started the program, I was doing construction work as a taper, sheetrocking walls and working with pretty giant materials. And I think that also informed an aspect of my work that treats painting sculpturally as something that can be molded into relief. I started making dot paintings in the late 80s. I replicated the white of the blank canvas by troweling white paint onto the support using a taping knife, setting up a wet ground to receive dots of equivalent size made by a repeated motion. I've tried to reduce painting to a set of repeatable conditions, emptying the process of intention, whim, or expression. But despite the proceduralism, the marks would vary based on tempo, gravity, and accident. The dots cast a material impression of the brush and the brushstroke, a brute but unverifiable index of the artist's presence. I was also intrigued by modes of marking that were not part of the arsenal of painting per se. I wanted to mimic the prestidigitation of touchscreens and retrace the relation between pressing, touching, and typing, fingerprinting, and authenticating. In White Night from 1989, I painted the same painting 16 times on separate panels of equal dimension and assembled them into a single work. There's a small space left between the gridded panels so that air circulates through the painting and the wall is exposed, making you aware of the support of the support. The result is like a film strip of 16 frames in which you don't know where one panel ends and another begins, the dots swarming and buzzing around mobile centers. This work, from 1992, restates the gap between the wood panels through the single line drip by folding the periphery into the frame and re-articulating the schisms and voids. I tricked the eye into doubting and doubling divisions between the panels. And what I did here is I prepared a wet ground on 36 panels and then one by one, made a single drip on each panel trying to guess exactly where it should go. So what you see is that the dripped lines are the same width of the space between panels, setting up that kind of optical confusion, but it's also a record of my inaccuracy. In 95%, I cropped the imaginary plane to reveal the material linen canvas underneath. I've always been drawn to the seductive teasing of masking and unmasking layers, the excess and ecstasy of opening up or revealing the truth of the ground, which only becomes another mask or illusion in turn. In Out, the flows and drips seem to project forward, but are also streamlined, sunken, and gathered into latent ridges and grooves that have been carved into the painting's ground. Illusory depth perception is ruptured by the material physics of the ground. The support becomes a petri dish for experiments in liquidity and gravity, or even a kind of irrigation system for managing drainage and leakage. In Four Corners, I painted the painting with an open matrix of dots, then painted the same procedures over it after re-establishing the white ground. The marks fall in different places, which is why you see traces of the first attempt in the tiny revealed edge at the bottom. In this work, there are competing grounds, successive layers with varying opacities that suggest shifting temporal registers and produce a spatial ambiguity. The bigger dots seem closer and advance, while the smaller dots seem farther away and recede, producing a binocular rivalry that jams optical synthesis. This unhinges the typical figure-ground relation in which figure comes forward and the ground sinks into the background. You can see a similar effect here. The magnified pattern on the left makes the right panel appear to recede. It's almost like a parallax view of the same pattern, one closer and one farther away. The panels could be read as a frame shift, a zoom in, a horizontal strip of film, a stereoscopic card, or the competing views of a left and right eye. And in this painting of Pores, it's the same conceit, but the actual canvas support shifts in size, doubling the confusion. At the time, I would often go from painting on the floor to painting on the wall. So there's a confusion between marks flowing downstream and the more amorphous splatters and pores from working on the floor. In the center of this painting, the ground opens up to reveal the linen canvas, which the paint drains into, sort of like a Barnett Newman zip, except he doesn't do the drainage. I called this painting 3/4 in reference to the 3/4 view in portraiture, as if this were a portrait of the painting itself. In my work, The picture plane often slides off the support as it tilts around an invisible hinge or axis. The dripping on the right is an accumulation of pigment and a washing away, a melting or muddling, so that the painting paints and unpaints itself, while the left side is left blank to underscore the real of the bare canvas. These are my first horror pours. While I was painting, I continuously flipped the canvas, so the painting fell upwards and downwards in turn. Mistakes and irregularities would often be intentionally repeated till I lost track of the difference between decisions, mistakes, jests, and gestures. I installed them close together to create a kind of wallpaper effect. This was also the first time I made a mechanical reproduction of a painting. I was curious to see how the drips would look when rendered by a machine. In this slide, the painting on the right is a machine-made reproduction of the painting on the left, the same format and size, but laterally flipped, so they are mirror images. Here, the detail of the printed surface shows that the painterly drips are made up of mechanical dots. In Sunset Blue, I painted the same painting on 2 panels simultaneously, so that I lost track of which panel came first and which came second. I was acting as a faulty machine that errantly strives to accurately copy marks, but instead multiplies discrepancies. In my Horizon series, I masked and spliced the canvas in ways that disrupt the continuous motion or flow of the brushstroke, and created a disruptive and unnatural horizon line. On either side of the horizon splice, the same set of painterly procedures is repeated. Rather than a division of land and sky, you see more of the same on both sides. In this painting, the continuity of the field is so strong, but your eye kind of keeps catching on this splice, which is sort of quietly insists. So there's a tension there. It's sort of hard to see in that painting, but Sunset Yellow bears an inverted shadow of itself on its face. First, I painted a yellow ground with red pores over it. Then I made hand-cut stencils of the pores, flipped the stencil upside down, and spray painted through the stencil in black enamel onto the painting. In this recent work, OO, some of my earlier strategies can be seen in new forms. There's a central motif with clear lateral symmetry, but the mirroring is undercut by several obstacles. One is the gap between the panels, which interrupts the surface's continuity. And another is the different degrees of magnification of the white noise pattern. The left pattern is bigger, and so appears closer than the right panel. The eye wants the right panel to fall behind the left panel, but they are locked onto the same plane by the mirrored motif. You look for distance cues in the painting to find your footing, but are thwarted by contradictory signs. I've always tried to invent new kinds of viewing conditions to ensnare the viewer away from the screen and get people to look at painting again. In my cinema paintings from the late 90s, I mimicked the 16:9 aspect ratio of widescreen film and tried to capture the screen's magnetic seduction through its receding depths. When something draws away from you, you gravitate towards it. The gradient plane envelops you into a void that can be a site for endless projection. When you stand before this painting, the highly illusionistic screen acts as a lure so that you disappear into the inky blackness. Here, there's a small parallelogram landing that serves as a viewing platform and tilts inwards like a floor plane, inviting the viewer into the painting. And then in 2005, I did my first show of blacklight paintings at Nye House in New York. I had recently been to Rothko's chapel, and I wanted to produce a different kind of sacred space, one that referenced rave culture, but also the hokey dark rides at amusement parks. Using blacklight also challenged me to overcome my chromophobia and maybe by painting in the dark, I felt a bit freer. It also created a highly theatrical exhibition space, since the viewer glows too, and becomes enveloped in the environment, often in ghoulish ways. Sampler shows an array of the procedures and tactics I was using then: masking, framing, pouring paint, big washy streaks made with giant sponges, and a cinema screen framed out like a window. In 2019, I did a blacklight show at Dia's Dan Flavin Institute in Bridgehampton. I made casts in fluorescent-infused resin of different materials, including driftwood, 3D printed seashells, and an existing painting of mine. This is a cast of a sheet of plywood with the Dia logo etched into it. Dia is very discreet with their logo, so I thought it would be provocative to use it and also stress the difference between the giant monumental land art scale you associate with Dia and this shrunken space I was working in, as if maybe the Dia logo might add some grandeur to the cramped space I was in. And here's a cast of actual driftwood, which is the transparent blue, resting on a cast of 3D printed driftwood. You can see the highly artificial yellow pixelated quality of the 3D print. So my idea for this show was, was in this downstairs space from where Dan Flavin's light pieces are quite magnificently displayed, and I felt like I was saying, like, okay, well, I'm imagining myself as like Dan Flavin's downstairs neighbor, who's really jealous of what he's doing up there, and I'm trying to kind of come up with my own version, In this earlier blacklight painting, a pixelated drip on the left serves as an avatar for the viewer to navigate the screen space as if playing Space Invaders. And here it is installed at the Wexner Center. My silver paintings were another way to compete with and mimic the effects of the screen. I mixed a highly reflective metallic paint that enabled light and shadow to flicker across the surface of the canvas, like the filmic silver screen. Like the blacklight paintings, the silver paintings change based on light conditions, so they can look pretty dead at times and very animated at other times, depending on the room or angle. A number of the silver paintings re-articulate the frame inside the painting, creating a kind of passepartout or double border, a liminal space that is neither inside nor outside the painting. This also sets up an arena for playing with excess, dripping over and bleeding through the perimeter. As in the dot paintings, I foreground the fact of the canvas as the place where painting can happen. My first move is to paint the border, and then I fill it up with painting. In Aegis, a silver shield or target inhabits the center of the painting. When I made this, I was spending a lot of time with my son playing with action figures. Only after installing the show did I realize I had made paintings loosely based on his toys. One work was a Transformer. This one is Captain America. Shields, like screens, reflect but also deflect and misdirect, allowing us to view things surreptitiously, the way Perseus used his shield to look askew at Medusa. Not seeing her head on, he was able to ensnare the ensnarer, using the power of the mirroring screen to see the demonic without being transfixed by it. Here, I depict Medusa as a green swarm of chaos in the center of the canvas. The Medusa always intrigued me because of the way she stupefies and paralyzes the onlooker. I kind of identify with Medusa in that my role is to transfix the viewer so that they freeze before the work. But I'm also interested in how expressions and gestures get petrified through new technologies, turned into codes or typefaces. So these are emojis that we made in the studio, and they're based off of Caravaggio's painting of Medusa, which is, if no one knows, it's painted on a shield. It's a convex painting. I really thought that the world needed Medusa emojis. The silver paintings often feature extreme weather conditions, twisters and hurricanes, centrifugal and centripetal forces, whirlpools, envelopes, slits, contractions, and expansions. In the orb, the painting seems to contract around a kind of sphincter at the center of the canvas, while also seeming to radiate outwards. In 4114, I used solvent to eat through and wash out the paint from the canvas. So like that sort of faint middle line, that triangular shape is just a cascade of solvent that washed the silver. So you're seeing the bare canvas under and then traces of black also. This elaborate frame was made using tiny slivers of tape. The frame is much more extensive than the painting's interior, reversing the typical precedence of center over margin. In this work, from 2011, erasure and overpainting are blurred together. It looks like a lacy texture that's been eaten through by moths, yet remains intact. The frame appears to be composed of multiple stacked frames, as if the painting contained further paintings, like a Russian nesting doll. The holes in the top layer reveal another painting underneath. I've always been struck by Deleuze's idea of the immanent plane, the way divided strata can compress together into a univocal compact field. I often build up layers of paint only to scratch through them, mixing up the conventions of painting as additive and sculpture as subtractive. After a quite elaborate sculpting and layering of material and gesture, I scrape the whole painting down using large cake knives so that the surface is reduced to a single plane that bears the traces of the painting which was removed, leaving behind a giant pile of shavings or slag. Much more is removed than is left on the canvas. This technique of scratching through layers is similar to the rainbow scratchboard, which many of us did as children, and has its origins in ancient Greek ceramics. Ceramics was the first medium I took up in high school, and it continues to affect the way I treat paint as a malleable substance. In XX, stenciled patterns of hand-drawn and mechanical X's compete due to variable sizing. I use lettering and signage as a fractal gridding or all-over surface. You can see the same tactic in alpha, but with dots rather than X's. The scale shift between layers creates an irresolvable tension. The bigger dots from behind press forward, and the smaller ones hold them in place, creating a pressure that acts like a force on the room. In 2014, I started to pattern emoticons to form screens or scrims in my work. In this piece, from afar, you only see a grid of abstract points, but as you move closer to get a better sense of what you're seeing, you discover that the pattern is made up of upside-down smiley emoticons. I was sarcastically employing blue as an expression of sadness, as if the painting came with its own feeling. I like the way painting unfolds and transforms as you approach it, like a Mandelbrot set. The infinite regress of obsessive detail filling up the apparent void of monochrome painting. And that's not really loading, so we're going to move on. So, this painting seems at first to be made of a field of dots with hole-like patches scattered throughout. But up close you see that it is composed entirely of meh emoticons. Even though I never used faces or figures in my work, I've been considering the way expression is encoded like a palette template since I started painting. These persona paintings from the early 2000s, which I've never shown, convey the possible personas and moods I can adopt as a painter. I would sometimes make these before I embarked on a new body of work is a kind of emotional setting. The expressions here, shown here, are grim determination, fear, and in the center, vampiric bloodlust, since the painter sometimes has to suck the blood of other painters for sustenance. The Enactor, from 2010, is a painting that was made through the fear persona. Quavering strokes suggest the violently shaking hand that painted them. This is from a group of works in which I stenciled magnified canvas grain patterns, making visible the usually obscured linen canvas, creating the impression that you are looking through the back of the canvas out toward the space where the viewer normally resides. So usually the painting rests on the canvas, right? Well, here the canvas is resting on the painting. And in this work, I masked into the stencil slashes in the style of Lucio Fontana, taking a negative, destructive gesture and turning it into an additive, positive branding. So you can see the slashes are embedded only in the stencil layer. And here we have Lucio Fontana making one of his Concetto Spaziale paintings with a matte knife. This painting, from 2022, shows the crisscrossing of stencil patterns made from canvas grain rubbings, pores, and Fontana slashes, and some alla prima painting too. Colon, 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 from 2014, was the climax of the Stencil Dots series, which had become a breeding ground for patterns, as if paintings were breeding paintings and dots begetting dots. In 2015, I had a sudden logic shift that took me away from regular patterns and toward the interfaces of computer gaming with its irregular, uneven patterns which unfold in narrative journeys across the pictorial field. I continued to use dots in my work, but in a new way, as they became interlaced with heterogeneous patterns. When I got my first desktop computer in the 90s, I obsessively played Doom, among other video games, but I soon quit since it started taking over my mind and body. Years later, gaming imagery trickled into my work as I started looking at the graphics as a material for painting. In this painting, High Noon, there's a kind of, the screen space, which is orange, is the yellow lines on the right recede and reflected by the faint white ones on the left, and they kind of recede, as if in a receding perspectival space, like as in a first-person seeker or shooter video game. This image is a simple pixelated rendering of the trees in a forest from Earthbound, a Nintendo video game from 1994, which I then converted into stencil patterns for a painting in 2016. So you can see the tree pattern is like the all-over black stencil pattern. And the black marks you see are repurposed drips from my 1980s paintings, which have been turned into pixelated blobs and resized. At a certain point, I realized I had made enough fresh marks, and I could simply use old marks to produce new ones. And this is a screen capture from Dwarf Fortress, an open source game made up solely of MS-DOS keyboard characters. In this painting, the keyboard characters become colorful scrims made up of entangled layers of varying magnitudes that cover over and yet remain transparent to the gestural field beneath. One of the characters that came to intrigue me was the omega, since as the last letter of the Greek alphabet, it could signal end times, end games, the end of painting. This painting is entirely covered in layers of omegas in varying scales and patterns. In the lower right, I signed or logoized the painting as omega. These works title themselves. In cat, I stenciled silhouetted emojis and grid components from MS-DOS, which were used as building blocks for early web pages. You can see this is the whole MS-DOS vocabulary, those kind of weird border shapes, broken, fragmented border shapes. I made stencils off those. In the chaos of multiple layers, there's a condensed single plane which holds these disintegrating and decomposing levels together. In 2015, I began to use the analog coding language ASCII, which stands for American Standard Code for Information Interchange. I would remake or translate earlier works into ASCII, which I then stenciled onto canvases in thick impasto. The translation shrinks the cumbersome painting into a mere piece of code based solely on light-dark values, which I can then blow up and use as a new surface, texture, and pattern. The left side of the slide shows the ASCII version of the earlier painting on the right. And I was really excited by this idea of collapsing a big 10-foot painting into this really tiny piece of code, or something you could email, and then it could just pop up back into a big 10-foot cumbersome painting again. These felt like limit cases for painting, enabling me to test the outer edges of its definition. But I've always wanted to delimit and stay within the scope of painting. In the detail, you can see how the ASCII letters sit thickly on the canvas due to the impasto stenciling and how my gestural application affects the surface's density. This ASCII work, which is here in the collection of Chicago Art Institute, shows another kind of gridding, lettering, and stenciling that was produced by an ASCII translation. So here's a detail of that painting, and you can see it's made up mostly of commas, semicolons, some omegas. So I could choose the characters that load into the ASCII program, which automates its image, but I can, by choosing what characters here, like small ones like periods, commas, it produces a much more open effect. Like it's a different color, kind of. Oh, yes, so the stencils for these ASCII paintings are as big as the paintings, but I have to make them in strips because the machine that makes the stencils is only so wide. And as you can see, I have my paint custom mixed, so it's very thick, like clay. And then I push it through the stencils with palette knives, and it takes a lot of kind of energy to get that paint on there. So, in TwoCat, I brought together pixelated blobs, hand-drawn X's, emojis, emoticons, splatters, and omegas that you can see in the blue layer. The figures stencil into the background, reappear in the foreground at a larger scale, as if the layers are communicating with each other. And so these figures, it's hard to see in the photo, but they're like very thick on top of an already thickly stenciled pattern of cat emojis. Here, it's as if two different paintings are stenciled together so that one idiom erupts into the other. In the middle of XXX asterisk X, you can see a latent ghostly imprint of alphabetic characters quietly insisting from underneath the colors and marks. These ghostly emanations are forged not by the contrast of light and color, but rather through the elevation of the surface. I call them latent images. When I stencil over these built-in latencies, the stenciling is disturbed in a way that indicates the presence of a buried and uneven yet invisible underlayer. So here, this is a smaller painting. You can see the kind of gray shapes. Those are in relief. And in the next one, here, they're recessed into a ground. The ground itself is in relief. And then when I stencil over, the paint kind of distorts at the edges of these reliefs and recesses, which kind of brings these marks back into view. The latencies are a very slight or squashed form of relief, which is why I sometimes consider my paintings to be like flat sculptures. Latencies are also like watermarks in that they don't destroy the unity of the manifest image so much as disrupt it. Watermarks were traditionally built into the support of the medium so as to be inimitable and covert, only visible under certain light conditions. They carry the imprint of the author or brand, verifying quality, authenticity, and originality. In our digital age, they also assert the propriety of images and serve as a paywall, barring free use. I've been increasingly playing in my work with the way that painting can incorporate its exterior through signatures, monograms, initials, inventory codes, captchas, brand names, institutional logos, and the names of artists. And here in this painting, in the lower right, is an aluminum cast of a 3D print of Barnett Newman's signature, which is then attached to the canvas, and it sits off the canvas like 2 inches and throws a shadow. I'm particularly drawn to captchas because of their randomized warping of letters. Captchas are completely automated public Turing tests used to determine if a user is a human or a computer. JH, Omega 1, Smiley Emoticon has become my own signature captcha. In this painting, I placed a 3D printed disc onto the center of the work that mimics the iPhone magnifying glass effect, and another disc on the right margin, an emoji with an emoticon face that seemingly, unhappily, patrols the border between the painting and the spectator, a kind of comments section. This defaced emoji is a reproduction of the sputtering effect produced when I used a handheld printing gun to make an image. This shows how new tools come to infiltrate my work in the way accident and misfires become cloned and stamped. So for instance, this is an image, this is like a menu of images that I made with a handheld printer gun, which I can fiddle with the settings to make it kind of malfunction. And then we make stencils off of these images at any size. Oh, and this painting is sort of a ganged up, it's a huge painting, but it's sort of ganged up images from a lot of things. There's like a huge pour that I made small near the top, and the kind of S shape is like a broken Mebius strip was from a tiny drawing I made. The X was from an even smaller tiny X ink drawing I made. The splatters are things that came out of the handheld printer gun, all kind of ganged up together like that. In 2020, I began working with curator Mark Godfrey on a limited retrospective of my work for the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio. For the show, I made a billboard-style painting with a giant captcha of J.H. Wex, which combines my initials with the name of the institution and has long tentacles cascading across the surface, like the aliens in John Carpenter's The Thing, suggesting the way institutional branding invades and spreads through the body of the artwork, threatening to break the work apart, but also binding it together. The work is a compound of 5 discrete paintings, individualized by distinct white noise patterns on every panel, yet unified by the latent captcha motif. For the Wexner install, I had to deal with an architecturally challenging place to install paintings. Peter Eisenman's architecture didn't include many walls that could support paint, if anyone knows it. And it's quite possible that he hated painting. One way I dealt with this was by allowing the back of the stretchers to be visible. Another conceit of unmasking and denuding painting by exposing its rear end or verso, which is usually invisibilized by wall hanging. For the J.H. Wex painting, we created a special structure in front of a glass wall that served as a kind of pedestal, making the work appear to float. I expanded on these exhibition ideas from my recent show at Green Naftali. I built out a window display for a billboard-style 5-panel painting with a latent Neiman Marcus logo scrawled laterally across it. And then I invited Rachel Harrison to make a mannequin sculpture which produce the feeling of an alienating storefront. Inside the gallery, you can see the exposed back of the work, just on metal studs, on a wall of metal studs. And John Kelsey called this work, quote, physical wedge or barricade, and I think this is apt, as I was thinking about the way Chelsea's Hudson Yards and the now bankrupt Neiman Marcus store seem to be pushing humans out in favor of simulacral screens and top-down design schemes. For the show, I also took my horror pores in a new direction. Blood and slime mixing together in gooey admixtures of varying viscosities, while splatters became all-over patterns. The phantom trace of names, brands, and figures has increasingly come to haunt and stain my work. In some, there is a latent shadow of gallery inventory numbers of other already existing paintings of mine. These numbers index the metadata for my work, as it exists in a vast and invisible network. I wanted to materialize this ominously immaterial support as a way to expose and mock the institutional apparatus of painting, and also to make paintings that refer to other paintings in a kind of self-cannibalizing gesture. In a similar vein, I made a 3D print of one of the paintings in the show that gives a depth map of the work, which can be used for accessibility purposes and creates a touchable, tangible extension of the original. Here you can see it installed near the painting which it is of, and it really kind of sat almost invisibly on that wall like a relief, which is what it is. But a lot of people would just walk by it and not see it, so it was sort of this quiet presence. I've become very interested in the Stop Oil protests, the way it brought painting into social media and the news, but also the way paintings are being repainted with these giant painterly pores and marks in a way that reminded me of my own work, the way I've channeled my own destructive impulses into the reflective space of art. So I started making what I call pre-vandalized paintings. In one work, there's a silhouette of a baby's hand, the imprint of a future climate protester on a painting installed to obstruct a doorway. I brought social protest in my paintings since the early 2000s when I started painting protest signs, and these are actually cast in aqua resin and then painted. They're not actually cardboard. Highlighting the way the support of the message can be its own kind of aesthetic statement. While I draw from the alphabets and characters of communication, there is no message or messaging in my work. I think the brute and mute letters and figures stripped of meaning nonetheless press upon us a ghostly kind of touch. Screens are both our main way of communicating and the biggest barricade to communication, becoming vehicles for gaslighting, ghosting, and avoidance. I use painting to create a different kind of screen that adheres to a more tactile mode of contact. I think white noise is the idiom of our moment, produced by stimuluses so amplified that they become nonsense and betray our desire for oblivion. In this four-panel work for the last Venice Biennale, white noise patterns obscure the latent images to the point that they are hardly discernible at all, from certain vantages, you can see the latent omega and smiley emoticon sort of in the center, bottom center. You can try to see it right now, but it's difficult. Actually, your iPhone sees it better than you do, strangely. It's clearer in the detail. Often people don't see it unless it's pointed out, though sometimes it appears unsuspectingly. Kind of like the anamorphic image of a skull on Hans Holbein's Ambassadors, which is only legible from an oblique angle. You really have to stand at the side to see the skull. Like I'm seeing it pretty correctly right now. You're probably not. My paintings actively resist photography, and I think it's important to grapple with what gets lost in that translation. So I hope I was able to convey some of the physics and materiality of the work to you, which is kind of an impossible task. So I thank you for bearing with me. And that's the end of my talk. But I welcome any questions. Thank you. Awesome. Any questions?
If there are any questions, we'll bring the microphone to you. You can just raise your hand. Over here.
Do you have any impression of the literal translation of the blue line just below what you're saying? It's sometimes kind of funny and kind of makes a comment on what you're saying about language and technology in a way. Mm-hmm. Now it's translating me.
Probably not completely accurately. So what is the question? I have nothing to do with that actually, but you know, it's an accessibility thing, so that's interesting. Yeah.
On the theme of accessibility, you referenced a couple of sort of evolving iterations for accessing your works through touch. And you also mentioned something offhand, which was your iPhone camera can see it better than you can. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about any other sort of magnifiers or media or filters or lenses through which you would like your work to be seen, either today or in some sort of imaginary future?
Well, I think, you know, it's really interesting the way that technology is sort of expanding the way that painting, my painting or anyone's, can be accessed and consumed. Like, and the way I got that idea was I went to this show in Frankfurt, Duchamp show at the Modern Museum there, and there was a 3D accessibility thing of one of the paintings of the bride. I thought, that's so, I got really excited about it. It's just, you know, something where people are unsighted, right, who to, you know, feel like what is there in the painting, because we can't touch paintings, right? So I don't know, it's sort of like I'm bringing these things into my work, you know, things like the accessibility or how technology is changing how we see and experience things, you know, social media, you know, emojis, all this stuff that we do on it, like keyboard characters, like suddenly one day in my life I'm like on a keyboard all the time. That's interesting. It's like all these things kind of push their way into the painting, right? It's almost like an irresistible pressure to like kind of begin to, like that the work just absorb these different things that are more and more present in our everyday life. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
in one of your paintings, I believe it was number 3113, you appear to have painted the frame itself, and that changes the dynamic visually. Is that an idea that you played with and abandoned, or what was your thinking? Because it didn't appear on other pictures that I saw. I
made a lot of paintings like that. I mean, it was just the way I painted for like a pretty extended period of time where I would make the frame first and then decide on a set of tools or procedures or ways that I was going to fill it up and then just kind of execute, and like that painting in particular was made in one day. It was actually New Year's Eve, 2013. I often like to make a painting for myself on New Year's Eve, and so yeah, it was just like a very kind of like, I always want to go back to very primitive conditions, right? Like, here I am sitting in front of this blank canvas, and so the first thing I do is like emphasize that or restate it in some way, and then I've like already kind of altered the space, and so that sets off another thing, which sets off another thing. So, but yeah, I made many paintings, and we recently put out a book that has a lot of these frame paintings in it. Yeah.
Time for one more question?
Are you going to get into NFT art, or you don't care for it?
I tried. And in fact, Felix and I were working on an NFT also, but I think the things I really wanted to do with it had to do, like one idea was to make an NFT that would like change over time, or that would disintegrate over time, or to the point of disappearance, right? And I just am not a coder, and so I was working with some people, and it was just very hard to try to communicate. So, I don't know, I kind of like, working on that made me really miss the immediacy of painting, where I could just turn around and make something. Like this is more like lots of emails and meetings, and and I was like, no, was not ever my idea of what I wanted to do with my day. So I gave up, but I'm looking to some really interesting things coming out of that technology, for sure. I mean, it's digital art, right? Yeah.
I'd like to thank you for the generosity of sharing your thinking and your process, and for breathing life back into painting. It's your guts. So
Thank you.
And yeah.
I think we have one more here. I think we have one more question in the back.
The question was scale. Most of what you presented is very large scale, as big as a body. Could you share your thinking in regards to scale?
I always painted big, it's just, I like, it's, I think it's really about real size, real scale, and, I kind of like, I actually, as many decisions go into small painting as a big one, like they're almost more forgiving, the big size, and I like to stand up when I paint and really be active and use my body, and it's sort of like an addiction, kind of, really bigger and then bigger and bigger. I think we have one more in the back.
Looking at several of your paintings where each one is sometimes reflective or commentary on some of the other ones, when you start a group, say a cluster of these four, do you have the concept from the outset that it's going to be four interacting with each other, or does it evolve starting with one and then you just add to it as they interact with each other?
It's like near the end where there was a bunch of paintings that really does make a series. So those paintings, no, that was a surprise, right? So I had these 3 paintings I worked on for like 6 months, very slow process where I was just add things, change things, and then one day I just thought I want to change up my tempo, and like tempo is a really important part of how I work, and so I just put them away, and then but a lot of things I did in those paintings, I found a way to kind of gang it up and make it. I just push these big brooms through the paint, and I stencil these dots over it, and then other things go on top, and they're very fast and immediate, and then they just started to roll out. It was really interesting, like the paintings just like made other paintings, and I made a lot of them, so that, that's often the way I work, like I'll just experiment, play, like go slow, and and just not really work with intent so much as like trying to like figure some things out, and then I'll get bored with that, put all that away, and then start, now I need to work with intent to make art, so to speak. And then, that can be really fun when I can just sort of, when the paintings just kind of flow like that. So that's how that happened, yeah. I just sort of rolled with it.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for being here
Thank you
with us
all very
tonight, and
much.
Thank you to
Yeah,
everyone
thank
who
you.
joined us.